When the empath finally refuses to carry the narcissist's wounds, something ancient stirs in the psyche. It is not merely the breaking of a relationship dynamic, nor is it a rebellion against another person's domination. It is a shift of archetypal proportions, a tremor in the hidden foundations of the soul, where shadow and light contend for mastery. For centuries, in countless myths, this moment has been anticipated. The moment when the sacrificial lamb ceases to walk willingly toward the altar, and instead gazes into the eye of the priest with the unyielding recognition of its own worth. You may think this is simply a psychological process. Yet, what I reveal to you is also a mystical process, one that vibrates in the depths of your unconscious and stretches its roots back into the collective unconscious of humanity. The empath has always been chosen, in a sense, chosen not by divine election in the outward sense, but by the hidden convergence of family wounds, ancestral shadows, and archetypal scripts that wove their fate from childhood. The empath becomes accustomed to absorbing the unspoken sorrows of others, to transmuting the unacknowledged shame, to becoming the vessel in which others offload their fragmented selves. This is not love in the authentic sense. Though it masquerades as such, it is an unconscious contract signed in the darkness, binding the empath to the narcissist, like the moon pulled by tides she cannot resist. The empath becomes the chalice of wounds that were never theirs, and in that role forgets their own being. But what happens when the chalice cracks, when the empath, weary of bleeding for another, suddenly refuses? This is the hour of initiation. To refuse is not an act of cruelty, but of awakening. It is the recognition that to continually carry what is not yours is to deny your own soul its right to individuate, to blossom into wholeness. The refusal marks the rupture in the archetype of the wounded healer, the moment when the healer ceases to sacrifice themselves to the endless abyss of another's hunger and begins instead to heal themselves. You may think this selfish, but in truth, it is the sacred inversion, the turning of the alchemical wheel that allows the empath to transmute not only their own suffering, but to reveal a deeper law of psychic life, that no one can become whole by stealing the light of another. The narcissist, confronted with this refusal, is cast into chaos, for their entire structure of being depends upon projection, upon offloading the unbearable fragments of their shadow into the empath who willingly carries it. The narcissist cannot face their own abyss, for to do so would threaten the fragile persona they cling to, and so they rage, they accuse, they manipulate, attempting to restore the order of dependency. Yet something in the empath has shifted irreversibly. They have glimpsed, even if faintly, the truth that they are not a mere extension of another's will, not a mirror reflecting back the grandiose image, not a wound bearer destined to bleed endlessly. They are a soul, sovereign and luminous, destined to wrestle with their own shadow and not chained forever to the shadow of another. In dreams, this moment often appears as the breaking of chains, as standing on the edge of a forest, no longer darkened by another's shadow. Some see a serpent that once coiled around their body loosen and slither away. Others find themselves walking out of a house in flames, realizing at last that they do not need to rescue those who refuse to leave the inferno of their own making. The unconscious speaks in images, and these images always reveal that the refusal is not an abandonment of compassion, but a return to authenticity. To refuse is to say, I will no longer betray my own soul for the sake of a false harmony. The empath's journey is the journey of individuation itself. To carry another's wounds perpetually is to remain entangled in projection. To avoid the confrontation with one's own inner shadow by taking on the narcissist's darkness, the empath has often unconsciously avoided facing the truth of their own hidden rage, shame, and need. It is easier to heal the wounds of another than to peer into one's own abyss. Yet, the refusal awakens the deeper call to retrieve the shadow, not from another's body, but from one's own depths. The narcissist then becomes less an enemy than a mirror, showing the empath how easily one can betray oneself under the guise of love. To step away is to begin the descent inward toward the labyrinth where the self waits. And yet, this is not a gentle process. When you refuse to carry the wounds of another, you awaken their demons, and they will unleash them upon you. You will be accused of betrayal, of selfishness, of cruelty. Your refusal will be painted as abandonment, as proof that you never loved at all. This is the archetypal voice of the devouring mother, of the tyrant father, of the vampire, who cannot bear to see the source of their sustenance withdraw. To withstand these projections requires courage, for the empath is deeply vulnerable to guilt. But the guilt itself is a sign of the old contract, a lingering echo of the unconscious pact that bound you to another's pain. To endure this guilt without yielding is the crucible of transformation. It is here that the myth of Christ bearing the sins of the world must be re-examined, for though it has been interpreted as an eternal command for empaths to carry others' wounds, its deeper meaning is symbolic. It reveals the archetypal burden of humanity's shadow, yet it does not command perpetual sacrifice of the individual soul. In fact, to mistake Christ's sacrifice as a model for endless empathic suffering is to misunderstand the symbolic truth that the redemption of humanity comes not from perpetual self-annihilation, but from the integration of shadow and light within the individual. To bear the sins of the world is to confront the shadow of the collective within oneself, not to absorb the wounds of another who refuses their own work. Thus, the empath's refusal is not rebellion against love, but an alignment with a deeper love for truth, love for the soul's wholeness, love for the self which cannot be realized in the prison of codependency. When you refuse, you declare to the universe, I will no longer participate in this distortion of love. I will walk my own path of shadow and light. I will no longer play the savior in another's unfinished story. And in that declaration, you open the gates of individuation, for the self responds to those who choose truth over illusion. This awakening also reveals the archetype of the wounded child within the empath, for so often the reason one carries another's wounds is because, as a child, they were taught to survive by absorbing the chaos around them. They learned to regulate the unspoken storms of their parents, to become the mediator, the healer, the unseen container of the household's shadows. The narcissist in adulthood becomes a symbolic repetition of that original parent, demanding again that the child's soul carry what is not theirs. The refusal, therefore, is not only a present liberation, but a healing of the past. It is the child at last saying to the parent, I will no longer hold what you could not face. I release myself from your unfinished shadows. In the psyche, this moment resounds like thunder. Dreams often reveal it as a rebirth, a baptism in water or fire. You may find yourself walking through a dark cave and emerging into light, or standing naked, yet unashamed before a vast ocean, realizing that the waters are no longer polluted with another's pain. The unconscious celebrates the refusal, for it knows that only in this refusal can the empaths finally begin their true work, the integration of their own unconscious material. To carry another's wounds endlessly is to live in exile from oneself. To refuse is to return home. Yet beware, the narcissist will not vanish quietly. They may attempt to lure you back with promises of change, with appeals to your compassion, with subtle manipulations cloaked as need. The empath must recognize these as echoes of the old contract, as phantoms attempting to bind them once more. Compassion does not mean return. Love does not mean submission. To love truly is to allow another the dignity of facing their own shadow, even if it destroys them. To carry their wound is to rob them of their dignity, to prevent their possible transformation. Thus your refusal, though painful, may be the only act of true love you can offer, and in this paradox lies the mystical truth. To refuse to carry another's wound is not abandonment, but a profound recognition of their soul's potential. It is to say, I see that you, too, are capable of meeting your own abyss. I will no longer prevent you from encountering yourself. I will no longer enable your evasion of the shadow. And I, too, will turn toward my own shadow, so that we may each walk the path of individuation, even if apart. The empath who has refused now stands at a threshold. You may feel that you have lost everything in this moment, for the scaffolding of your psychic life was often built upon the fragile architecture of carrying another's wounds. When that structure collapses, a great emptiness may open before you. Yet this emptiness is not a void to be feared, but the fertile darkness from which new life emerges. It is the same darkness of the womb, the cavern of transformation, the alchemical nigredo where all form dissolves before the rebirth of the self. The psyche, when stripped of illusions, does not leave you barren. It invites you to discover what has always been waiting behind the masks. The narcissist, who once seemed larger than life, begins to shrink in the psyche's landscape. Without your light to feed upon, without your wounds to deposit their own into, they are revealed as what they always were, a fragmented soul terrified of annihilation. Yet, this recognition must not lead you to contempt, for contempt is merely another projection of shadow. Instead, you begin to see with clarity their grandiosity was only a defense against the abyss within. Their manipulation was only the desperate grasp of one drowning in their own unconscious. When you see this, you are freed not through hatred, but through understanding, compassion without sacrifice, clarity without entanglement. This is the new stance of the individuating soul. And here we must speak of the archetype of possession. When the empath carries the narcissist's wounds, they are in fact possessed not by demons in the literal sense, but by archetypal forces that consume their psychic energy. The archetype of the savior, distorted and inflated, takes hold of the empath, binding them in a role they did not consciously choose. To refuse is to perform an exorcism of this archetype, to strip away its false divinity and reveal that salvation is not demanded of you for another's sake. Salvation in the Jungian sense is individuation, and that is a task each soul must shoulder alone. If you carry their wound, you prevent their individuation and you delay your own. To refuse, therefore, is to return the archetype to its rightful place in the psyche, not as a tyrant demanding perpetual sacrifice, but as a symbol pointing you inward towards your own integration. Dreams will often mirror this shift with startling imagery. You may dream of a puppet master whose strings suddenly snap and the marionettes fall lifeless to the floor. You may dream of a monstrous figure dissolving into smoke when you turn your gaze directly upon it. These images signify the collapse of possession. The narcissist's power was never in themselves, but in your unconscious willingness to play the role written for you. Once you refuse, the entire play dissolves and you step backstage, realizing you were both actor and audience all along. But this liberation demands a new responsibility, the confrontation with your own shadow. For as long as you carried another's wounds, you could avoid your own. Now there is no excuse. The empaths must descend into the labyrinth of their own unconscious to encounter the hidden rage that was never expressed, the grief that was buried, the desire that was disowned. This is the true work, and it is not easy. Yet, it is the only path that leads to wholeness. To refuse the narcissist is only the beginning. To face oneself is the deeper task. Here lies the paradox. The narcissist's presence in your life was both a prison and a portal. By entrapping you, they forced you to awaken. By demanding your sacrifice, they revealed to you the power of refusal, and by casting their shadow upon you, they mirrored the very shadow you must now embrace. Consider the myth of Persephone, dragged into the underworld by Hades. Many interpret it only as an abduction, yet it is also a descent into the unconscious. Persephone becomes queen of the underworld, not by resisting her fate, but by integrating it. So too the empath. You are not meant to remain forever in the upper world, denying the depths. The narcissist's wounds were the hand pulling you downward, but once you refuse to carry them, you descend by choice into your own inner Hades, where you may discover the hidden treasures of the unconscious. There you may find your own neglected child, your own dark goddess, your own wellspring of power. For only by embracing the shadow can one ascend into true light. When the empath makes this descent, fear arises. You may fear becoming like the narcissist, to fear that by refusing to carry others, you will fall into selfishness. Fear that by embracing your shadow, you will unleash destruction. But know this, individuation does not destroy love. It purifies it. When you no longer love from compulsion, from guilt, from unconscious repetition, your love becomes a conscious choice. It is no longer the binding sacrifice of the martyr, but the radiant gift of one who stands whole. Such love cannot be exploited, for it does not seek to rescue. It seeks only to meet the other as they are. This is the love that arises when the empath has refused, when the archetype of savior has been dethroned. When the shadow has been faced and integrated, the narcissist may return, seeking once more to bind you. They may appeal to your memories, to the tenderness that once enslaved you, but something within you has changed. You no longer see through the same eyes. You no longer confuse pity with love, guilt with obligation, sacrifice with holiness. You see clearly, and in that clarity lies your power. This is the emergence of the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends ego and shadow alike. The self is not inflated. It does not demand. It does not devour. It radiates from within like the sun, steady and unshaken. To align with the self is to know that you are not responsible for carrying what does not belong to you, but you are responsible for embodying your own truth. And in this new stance, you begin to perceive the world differently. You see how many relationships are built upon this hidden contract of wound bearing. How societies themselves thrive on empaths, carrying the shadows of those who refuse responsibility. You see how families pass down this burden generation after generation until someone at last says, no more. You realize that your refusal is not merely personal but archetypal, that by refusing you participate in a larger movement of the collective unconscious seeking to heal itself. For when even one empath refuses, a new pattern enters the world, a pattern in which love is no longer chained to sacrifice, in which wholeness is no longer postponed, in which the self is honored above the demands of projection. This, then, is the task before you. Not merely to refuse once, but to live in that refusal daily, to embody it as a way of being. Each time you are tempted to take on another's wound, each time guilt whispers that you must return, each time the old archetype seeks to reclaim its throne, you must return to the truth. I am not your vessel. I am not your shadow bearer. I am not your savior. I am myself, and I will walk the path of my own wholeness. In this daily remembrance, you strengthen the new pattern, and you become less susceptible to possession, less vulnerable to projection, more rooted in the ground of the self, and perhaps one day you will meet the narcissist not with fear or hatred, but with a quiet recognition. You will see them still caught in their web of defenses, still casting shadows, still seeking vessels, but you will not step forward to carry. You will stand firm, offering neither enmeshment nor rejection, but a silent mirror of wholeness. And whether they awaken or remain asleep will no longer matter to you, for you will have crossed the threshold and you will never again be bound by the old contract. You will have become free. The empath who has stepped away from carrying the narcissist's wounds now feels the silent weight of their own shadow pressing in. This is the point at which many falter, because the absence of another's suffering leaves you with the raw encounter of your own. You can no longer distract yourself with rescuing. You can no longer disguise your avoidance behind the mask of compassion. The silence exposes you, and in that exposure, the unconscious begins to rise like a tide, bringing forth images and impulses that were long buried. At first, you may feel as though you are unraveling. In truth, it is the unraveling of the false garment you once wore, so that you might clothe yourself in authenticity. The shadow does not come gently. It appears in dreams as monstrous figures, as broken houses, as floods that threaten to drown you. You may dream of standing in front of a mirror that shows you not your face, but the snarling visage of an animal. You may dream of blood, of betrayal, of violence. These are not omens of doom, but invitations to integration. The unconscious speaks in symbols, and it reveals what you have denied, the rage you swallowed, the grief you concealed, the desire you disowned all rise, like phantom demanding recognition. If you resist them, they will haunt you. If you embrace them, they will become your allies. For the shadow, once accepted, is the key to wholeness. This is where the archetype of the healer transforms. At first, the empath's healing was outwardly directed, compulsive, bound to the wounds of others. But once the refusal has taken place, healing turns inward. You realize that the wound you carried for others was a reflection of the wound you carried for yourself. The narcissist's insatiable need mirrored your own unmet hunger for recognition. Their grandiosity reflected your own repressed desire to be seen. Their inability to love revealed your own fear of intimacy. To see this is painful, but it is the beginning of individuation. You discover that what enraged you in them was already alive within you. The narcissist is no longer merely an abuser. They are a mirror of your own shadow. To integrate this truth is to reclaim the power you once gave away. At this stage, the psyche may test you with temptations. The old patterns will beckon. You may find yourself drawn again to those who radiate need, to those who demand rescue. It will feel familiar, even comforting, to slip back into the role of the wound bearer. But each time you do, the soul will whisper its protest, and your dreams will darken, showing you cages and prisons, reminding you of the cost of your unconsciousness. If you are attentive, you will recognize these temptations as the echoes of the old contract. As remnants of possession, you will remember the refusal, and you will step back into freedom. This is also when guilt becomes most acute. You may feel the weight of generations pressing upon you, the ancestral voices saying, "We have always carried the burdens of others. Who are you to stop now?" You may hear the echo of parents who demanded your silence, siblings who leaned on your strength, lovers who drained your energy. To say no in this moment is to defy not only the narcissist before you, but the ancestral pattern behind them. It is to declare that the chain of repetition ends with you. Such defiance awakens archetypal forces, and the guilt can feel unbearable. Yet it is through this guilt that the soul passes from bondage into freedom. For guilt is not always proof of wrongdoing. Often it is the sign that you are breaking free from a system that thrived on your subjugation. Consider the alchemical image of the black sun, the Sol Niger. It is the symbol of the dark illumination, the revelation that comes not in light, but in darkness. When you sit with your guilt, your rage, your grief, when you refuse to run from them, you begin to see a different light, a light that shines not above but within, a light born of the very shadows you once feared. This is the beginning of inner authority, no longer dependent on external validation, no longer enslaved by the need to be the savior. You begin to trust the wisdom of your own depths. You realize that the unconscious is not your enemy, but your guide. That the self is speaking through the very images that disturb you, and as this realization deepens, love itself changes form. Love ceases to be a transaction of wounds. It ceases to be the unconscious pact of sacrifice. Instead, it becomes the recognition of wholeness in another, even if they cannot yet see it in themselves. You do not rush to heal them, nor do you flee from their darkness. You simply stand in your own center, radiating the wholeness you have begun to embody. This is a love that liberates rather than binds. It is the love of the self, the archetype of completeness, which embraces shadow and light alike. Such love cannot be corrupted by narcissistic hunger, because it does not feed on depletion. It gives without losing. It receives without demanding. It is, in truth, the love that was hidden beneath the false patterns all along. But this emergence is not the end. It is the midpoint of a lifelong journey. Individuation is never complete in a single act of refusal. It is a continual dance with the unconscious, a perpetual balancing of opposites, a constant dialogue with the shadow. The empath who has awakened must return again and again to the inner work, for the patterns of possession are cunning and persistent, yet each return strengthens the soul. Each confrontation with shadow reveals new depths of power. Each refusal of the old contract opens new pathways of freedom. Over time, the empath no longer identifies as merely a healer of others, but as a whole being capable of embracing both darkness and light, capable of giving and receiving without compulsion, capable of walking alone without fear. And when you reach this stage, you begin to glimpse the mystical vision of wholeness. You realize that the narcissist was never your enemy, but an unwitting initiator. By demanding your sacrifice, they drove you to awaken. By wounding you, they forced you to seek healing. By casting their shadow upon you, they compelled you to discover your own. In this paradox lies the secret. The narcissist was both destroyer and teacher, both prison and portal. To see this is to be freed from hatred, freed from bitterness, freed from the endless cycle of blame. You do not excuse their behavior, but you no longer remain chained to it. You see the archetypal drama for what it was, and you step beyond it into the vastness of the self. The empath who has endured the crucible of refusal and shadow confrontation now begins to sense the stirring of something wholly new. It is as though an ancient seed long buried within the soil of suffering cracks open and begins to reach upward toward the unseen light. This is not yet the triumphal stage of wholeness, but the fragile dawn of sovereignty, the first breath of a soul unbound. The emptiness that once felt unbearable now reveals itself as space. Space for the self to unfold. Space for the voice of the unconscious to be heard without distortion. Space for love that does not annihilate. In this opening, the empath realizes that what they mistook for loss was in truth the shedding of false garments. Nakedness before the self is not shameful, it is sacred. At this stage, dreams often shift in character. The images become less terrifying, less monstrous, and more numinous. You may dream of walking through a vast forest where the trees no longer threaten but protect, where the path, though unknown, feels strangely familiar. You may see symbols of sovereignty, a crown discovered in the earth, a throne long abandoned, yet waiting for your return. Such images signal the archetype of the sovereign soul, emerging the realization that you are not destined to live as a subject in the kingdom of another's shadow, but as a ruler within your own inner domain. Sovereignty does not mean dominance over others. It means mastery over yourself, over the impulses and shadows that once ruled you unconsciously. The narcissist fades into the background of this vision. They are no longer the axes around which your psychic life revolves. Their wounds no longer dictate your movements. Their shadow no longer defines your light. You may still feel echoes of their presence, but these are like ghosts, unable to harm you unless you summon them again. For the true battle was never with them. It was always with the archetypal pattern they embodied. By refusing, by integrating, you have broken the spell. The narcissist as a person may continue their old dance, but the archetype they carried no longer possesses you. This is the liberation of the soul from the tyranny of projection. And yet, sovereignty is not isolation. It is not the withdrawal into sterile independence. To be sovereign is to stand whole and then to meet the other not as savior or victim, but as equal. Love is reborn here in its pure form, not as a transaction of wounds, but as a communion of souls. When you love from sovereignty, you are no longer consumed by the fear of abandonment, nor are you seduced by the illusion of rescue. You love because love flows naturally from the self, like a spring that cannot be stopped. And this love, paradoxically, is stronger than the sacrificial love you once knew, because it is not entangled in unconscious compulsion. It is love that liberates both giver and receiver. This transformation does not remain within the bounds of the individual. It reverberates outward into the collective unconscious. Every empath who refuses, who confronts their shadow, who steps into sovereignty, contributes to the healing of humanity's great imbalance. For the dynamic of the narcissist and the empath is not merely personal. It is cultural, ancestral, archetypal. Societies have long thrived on the exploitation of the sensitive, the silencing of the compassionate, the manipulation of those who cannot bear to see suffering. By awakening, you interrupt this cycle. You become a living symbol of another possibility. You show that it is possible to love without annihilation, to give without depletion, to be compassionate without being consumed. And in doing so, you open a path for others to follow. The collective unconscious responds to such awakenings with synchronicities. You may notice meaningful coincidences, books falling into your hands at the right time, strangers speaking words that echo your dreams, events aligning in ways that feel orchestrated. These are not accidents, but signs that you are in harmony with the deeper order of psyche. The self, having been acknowledged, begins to guide you with subtle threads of connection, weaving your life into the greater tapestry of meaning. To trust these signs is to live in dialogue with the unconscious. to recognize that individuation is not a solitary act, but a cosmic one. You are not isolated in your journey. You are participating in the eternal drama of the soul's awakening. But beware the temptation of inflation. When the empaths first taste sovereignty, there is a danger of swinging to the opposite extreme, of mistaking liberation for superiority, of becoming the very narcissist you once refused. The unconscious is cunning, and it will test you. You may feel the surge of power and believe that you are beyond others, that your awakening sets you above. This is another form of possession, subtler, but just as dangerous. True sovereignty is humble, for it recognizes that the self is not yours alone, but a manifestation of the archetypal wholeness that belongs to all. To guard against inflation, you must remain in dialogue with your shadow, acknowledging that you too are human, that you too contain contradictions and darkness. Sovereignty is not perfection, it is wholeness. And so the empath's refusal becomes not only an act of liberation, but a lifelong practice. Each day you may be tempted to slip back into old patterns, to carry what is not yours, to confuse love with sacrifice. Each day you must remember the truth, that to love authentically is to allow both yourself and the other the dignity of facing your own shadows. Each day you must return to the inner throne, not as a tyrant, but as a servant of the self. In this practice, you become an embodiment of individuation, a living testimony that the archetypal patterns can be transformed, and through you, the collective unconscious is slowly healed. When you look back, you may see the narcissist not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Not because their harm was justified, but because their presence forced you into awakening. They were the catalyst of your transformation, the dark figure who led you to the light. This does not excuse them, but it does release you from hatred. You see them as a figure in the great drama, as necessary to your path as the shadow is to the light. And in that recognition, you are free. You no longer carry their wounds, nor do you carry resentment. You carry only the truth of your own soul, radiant and whole. When the empath has fully stepped into sovereignty, the world itself begins to appear different. What once seemed like a battlefield of wounds, a landscape filled with predators and victims, now reveals itself as a vast theater of archetypes, a cosmic play in which each soul enacts the drama of shadow and light. To see this does not mean you withdraw in detachment. Rather, it means you participate consciously. You no longer mistake the mask for the essence, nor do you allow yourself to be bound by another's unconscious role. You see through appearances to the deeper forces moving beneath, and in that seeing you become free. Freedom, however, is not the absence of responsibility. It is the assumption of a deeper responsibility, the responsibility to live in truth, to embody wholeness, to honor the self. This is not a light burden, for the self demands more of you than any narcissist ever could. The narcissist demanded your sacrifice, the self demands your transformation. The narcissist devoured your energy, the self consumes your illusions. To walk with the self is to walk the razor's edge, for it calls you to embrace both shadow and light, both suffering and joy, both death and life. But unlike the narcissist, the self does not enslave. It liberates through confrontation, through integration, through the relentless call to authenticity. In this place of integration, you begin to experience what the mystics have always described, the union of opposites. You realize that within you are both empath and narcissist, healer and wounded, shadow and light. To deny this is to fragment. To accept it is to become whole. You see that the narcissist outside was a mirror of the narcissist within, that the compulsion to save was itself a form of control, that the wounds you carried were not wholly foreign, but resonant with your own. To integrate this is not to justify abuse, but to recognize the archetypal truth that what we meet in the other is always also within ourselves. This is why individuation is the highest form of love, for it allows you to embrace the whole of yourself and therefore to see the whole of the other without illusion. Dreams at this stage may reveal images of union, a wedding, a sacred marriage, the conjunctio of alchemy, where sun and moon embrace, king and queen merge, opposites become one. These are not mere fantasies, but symbols of the psyche's wholeness. The empath, once fractured by sacrifice, now discovers the inner marriage of their own masculine and feminine, their own shadow and light. This is the mystical fulfillment of individuation, the state in which the self radiates from within, and life is lived not as an endless repetition of wounds, but as a conscious dialogue with meaning. And when you stand in this wholeness, the narcissist no longer holds power over you. They may rage, they may accuse, they may attempt to rebind you, but their words fall like echoes in a cavern where no resonance remains. For you are no longer the chalice of their wounds. You are the vessel of your own soul. You may even look upon them with compassion, not the compassion of pity or sacrifice, but the compassion of recognition. You see them still bound to their shadow, still enslaved by their defenses, still afraid of the abyss within. And though you do not carry their wounds, you hold space for the possibility that they too may awaken. Whether they do or not is no longer your burden. You have fulfilled your task. At times, a strange gratitude may arise. Gratitude not for the harm, but for the initiation. For had you not carried their wounds, you might never have discovered your own. Had you not been bound, you might never have known the taste of freedom. Had you not been broken, you might never have sought wholeness. The narcissist, in this sense, was a dark teacher, an unwitting guide into the depths of your own soul. And in that paradox, you discover one of the deepest truths of the psyche, that even the darkest encounters serve the evolution of the soul. If only we have the courage to confront and integrate them. This is the mystical culmination of refusal, not merely the breaking of a bond, but the birth of a new way of being. You no longer live as a wound bearer, nor as a victim, nor even as a savior. You live as one who has embraced the totality of the psyche, who walks with the self as guide, who participates in the great mystery of individuation. Your presence itself becomes healing, not because you carry others' wounds, but because you embody wholeness, and wholeness, when seen, awakens wholeness in others. This is the silent gift of the individuated soul, to radiate what you have become without demand. without compulsion, without depletion. And so when the empath finally refuses to carry the narcissist's wounds, it is not an end, but a beginning. It is the beginning of the descent into shadow, the beginning of the ascent into sovereignty, the beginning of the union with the self. It is the breaking of an ancient contract and the signing of a new covenant with your own soul, with the archetypal wholeness that guides all humanity. This covenant is not written in ink, but in the very fabric of your being. It is enacted each time you choose truth over illusion, authenticity over compulsion, wholeness over sacrifice. To live this way is to walk a path few dare to tread. It is to stand in the mystery of your own depths, to confront demons and discover angels, to embrace contradictions without fear. But it is also to live with a joy unknown to those who remain bound, a joy that arises not from external validation, but from the inner harmony of the self. And this joy, once discovered, can never be taken from you, for it is not given by another, it is born from within. So I say to you, do not fear the refusal, do not fear the guilt, the emptiness, the darkness that follows, for beyond them lies the radiance of the self, the wholeness that is your birthright, the freedom that no narcissist, no shadow, no archetype can ever destroy. This is the mystery of individuation. This is the truth that waits when the empath finally refuses. This is the path of wholeness, and it is yours to walk